when is it reason to believe that something's true? See, that's a contentious question, but I think Hume got it pretty much right when he said that the rational person is a person who apportions their beliefs according to the evidence. And that's quite general, and it applies to contradictory truths in as much as it applies to non-contradictory truths. You look at the evidence. If you take the liar paradox, you look at the arguments that have been given for the liar paradox, you see whether you can break them in any plausible way. If you can't, then the evidence points in their favour.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Graham Priest. He is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is a logician, very well known for his work on Dialetheism, paraconsistent logic, and logical paradoxes. He's also worked on other issues in logic, epistemology, philosophy of language, Eastern philosophy, and more. His books include Logic, a Very Short Introduction, Beyond the Limits of Thought, Toward Non-Being, The Semantics of Metaphysical Conditionality, and many more. And he has numerous published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, Professor Graham Priest.
Hi, thanks for having me, so to speak.
All right. So I think many people will be familiar with some of your work and central views, but just to help develop the discussion further on, if you could just briefly describe your view as a dialetheist, that would be helpful.
Okay. So, look, I'm not quite sure what audience I'm talking to, so I'm not quite sure what I can assume. So let's. Go on.
Well, I'll just let you know it's a wide range of philosophical competence, so you can assume a little bit, but maybe not too advanced.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So let's start fairly basically. There are these things called contradictions. That word gets used in many ways, but when logicians use the word, they mean things of the form, the sun is shining and the sun is not shining, Donald Trump is wise and Donald Trump is not wise, the moon is round and the moon is not round. So things of the form P and not P, as logicians would express themselves. That's what logicians mean by a contradiction. And in Western philosophy, since Aristotle, it's been kind of orthodoxy that no contradiction, nothing of that form, can be true. Dialetheism is the view that some things of that form are true. Not the kind of silly examples that I gave you just now, but we could talk about what sorts of things fall in this category in a minute if you like. But just as a definition, dialetheism is the view that some contradictions are true.
And so a common criticism that I've come across, including with people on this platform that are critical of dialetheism, is that they don't really understand what is being said when a contradiction is asserted. So what do you think of the claim that a dialethia is not even meaningful?
Well, this is a very unorthodox view, just because most people, at least most contemporary philosophers, would take it to be perfectly meaningful and just plain false. So, there's an old joke that was used by feminists, and a good joke. Which bit of no don't you understand? Right. So I say to you, the sun is shining and the sun is not shining. Do you understand sun? Do you understand shining? Do you understand not? Have I put those together in a grammatical fashion? Sure. So what is it about this thing that you don't understand?
I think maybe in that case, some people would think of the meaning, at least in part, in terms of like the truth conditions of the statement, and for them, they can't really understand what the truth conditions are, I guess, in a way.
Well, again, this is a very unorthodox view. Even very orthodox logicians would tell you that the sun is shining and the sun is not shining has determinate truth conditions. It's true if and only if the sun is shining and not shining. So it has truth conditions, it has meaning. It's just that those truth conditions are not and cannot be satisfied.
So we had a question from Seb, who asks, in the second edition of your book from 2008, An Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, there is an appendix to part 1 where you survey some basic results in philosophical applications of many-valued logic. What is the importance of many-valued logics, modal logics, and are they still important philosophically today?
Okay, several things going on there. Let's step back. Question, what's the importance of logic? Well, okay, we could spend the rest of the hour or 2 hours talking about that. But, you know, as a quick answer, logic is important because it deals with the norms for correct reasoning. What follows from what and why. And philosophers and logicians, East and West, have been investigating that question now for 2,500 years. There's a lot of controversy. It's a branch of philosophy, and philosophy is always controversial. But the two areas of logic that the questioner mentioned were modal logic and many-valued logic. So those are two aspects of something that's now come to be called non-classical logic. All right, so a little bit of historical background. If you do a class in Logic 100 nowadays, or if you learn your first course in logic, you'll learn something called classical logic. And this is essentially a theory of logic that was invented at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century by a couple of great mathematicians called Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell. And it's still, I think, true to say that it's the orthodox logic of its day, but it is a creature that's now over 100 years old. And of course, logic has developed a long way since then. And the branches of logic that have been developed in the last 50 years tend to be called non-classical logic because they go beyond classical logic in some ways. All right. Now, let's take modal logic and many-valued logic separately because they are different. In the language of classical logic, you meet words like not, and, or. You don't meet words like must, can, possible, necessary. These are called modal words. And how those work, or inferences work for those containing those words, has been studied in the West for as long as there's been logic. I mean, the subject was broached by Aristotle. So this is a very old part of logic. As I say, the logic of these words is not part of classical logic, but it was brought back into logic very soon after the invention of classical logic. And nowadays, it's a very, very central part of logic. And the techniques that are used for investigating the inferences concerning these words have turned out to be very, very important in logic just because they're very versatile. So there's a branch of logical investigations called world semantics, which talks about situations other than the actual, maybe possible, maybe impossible. The techniques are often attributed correctly, I think, to Saul Kripke, and he proposed them in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and now these are absolutely central to so many logical endeavors. So yes, modal logic is absolutely central to logic nowadays. Many-valued logic is slightly different. It hasn't got such a long history. Classical logic and most logic until the early 20th century assumed that everything was either, or every declarative statement is either true or false, not both, not neither. And many valued logics are logics which dispense with that assumption that there can be some kind of third possibility, maybe both true and false, maybe neither true nor false. And the history of many valued logics go again just after the invention of classical logic in the work of the Polish logician Łukasz. And nowadays, the study of many valued logics is a very well developed and extensive branch of non-classical logic. What significance it has depends on the claim that there can be things which have this third or fourth or fifth or whatever truth value. And there are many philosophical arguments which suggest that some things go beyond the sort of basic true-false dichotomy. That's philosophically contentious. It's an ongoing debate in philosophy. But at least the investigation of systems of logic, where there are more than these two basic possibilities, is now a very well developed area of contemporary logic.
All right, great. We had another question from Haiku, who was wondering, in your paper, Metaphysical Necessity, Skeptical Perspective, you critique several different arguments supporting the notion of metaphysical necessity. And he's curious about what you think of other examples someone could provide, say, concerning the existence of God, or like causal principles like from nothing, nothing comes. What would you think of such alleged examples of metaphysically necessary statements?
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. So the question, are those examples of metaphysically necessary statements? It's sort of a prior question of whether they're true in the first place.
Right.
But let's grant, for the sake of argument at least, that they're true. The question is then, are they necessarily true in any sense? Some people have certainly thought so. Some people have certainly thought so. There are, of course, many senses of necessity. Metaphysical necessity is one of them. Logical necessity is another. Physical necessity is another. So the question arises as to whether examples like that are necessarily true in any of these senses. Nothing comes from nothing. If that's true, I'm inclined to think that it's a contingent truth. At least if it's not simply contingently true, I think we need an argument that it's necessary in some sense. There may well be such an argument. I'm not sure that I know what it will be. And I guess I'd say much the same about the claim that God exists. Again, we're assuming it's true for the sake of argument. If it's true, I'm not sure that it's necessarily true in any sense. I mean, I know that many medieval theologians thought this. I'm not sure they have particularly good arguments for it, but I'm prepared to listen to such arguments. So just sort of summarizing the answer to your question, these are possible candidates for metaphysical necessity, and assuming they are true, I'd kind of like to know what sort of arguments support the claim that they're necessarily true in a metaphysical sense.
Great. Do you think that the notion of metaphysical necessity is like well defined, or do you think there's some issue there?
No, I think you can probably define it in a coherent way. Look, here's one way you might do it. Think first of all of physical necessity, or natural necessity. What makes something physically necessary? Well, something's physically necessary if it holds in virtue of the laws of physics. Okay, we might sort of fiddle around with that to make it a bit more precise, but you've got the idea. In the same way, something's metaphysically necessary if it holds in virtue of the laws of metaphysics. And then the question of whether there are things which are metaphysically necessary is precisely the question of whether there are laws of metaphysics, and not just contingent truths of metaphysics, but things which are worth calling laws as opposed to sort of accidental generalizations. So that's where the debate goes. So I don't think the notion is incoherent, but I just think it raises a question about the status of metaphysical claims in general.
Fair enough. And Haiku was also wondering, in that same paper, you've also stated that mathematical necessity should be taken to be categorically distinct from metaphysical necessity and sui generis. Would you mind elaborating on that view?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question. A very traditional view was that mathematical truths were put in the same category as logical truths and other analytic truths. That is, they're kind of true in virtue of meaning. And I suppose I subscribed to that view at one stage. I've become very dubious of that view for reasons to do with my views on the nature of mathematics changing. And I've become very sympathetic to a view called mathematical pluralism, which says that mathematical views are not true simpliciter, but true in certain kind of structures, and there can be very, very different kinds of structures. I mean, this takes us back to the question of non-classical logic. So nowadays we know of branches of mathematics which are based on non-classical logic, like paraconsistent logic and intuitionistic logic. And what holds of these is that the mathematics holds in certain kinds of non-classical structures, and old-fashioned mathematics, which is perfectly good, of course, holds in classical structures. Now, if you subscribe to that view of mathematical pluralism, then because you can't really talk about truth anymore, you can't talk about necessary truth in exactly the same sense. You've got to talk about truth in a structure. So mathematical truth is going to be holding in a structure. So that can have a kind of mathematical necessity. Once you set up the structure, everything follows. But it's not going to be the old kind of necessity in which people used to think that arithmetic and set theory and so on are necessary. Okay, look, what I've just said makes a lot of assumptions that the person that asked the question knows what I'm talking about. So I may well have sort of gone off far to an abstract level. So if that's true, you've got to come back in me.
No, that's good. I'll ask a sort of related question on the philosophy of mathematics and Abstracta more generally. Do you have a view on sort of the ontology of mathematical entities? Do you think there are abstract objects in the Platonist sense, or what's your view in that regard?
Look, that is an easy answer. That is an easy question to answer. Yes, I think mathematical objects are abstract objects, but I think they're non-existent objects. So another of my slightly heretical views is that some objects don't exist. Obvious examples are fictional objects like Sherlock Holmes. Maybe that's everyone's favorite example. But I'm inclined to think that abstract objects, of which mathematical objects are one species, are non-existent objects too. So That's an easier question to answer.
Great. I guess speaking of some of your views on fictional objects, I mean, I'll be honest. I find myself, for example, quite committed to the view that our linguistic practices neither create nor require the existence of, like, say, unicorns or golden mountains. What would you say to try to convince me out of that view?
Okay. Look, the natural home of non-existent objects in the first place is intentional discourse, by which I mean discourse which is directed, in which we use words describing mental states which seem to be directed at objects. Okay. Think of the Eiffel Tower. Are you thinking of something?
Yes, although there's a potential ambiguity there in that I have some sort of representation in mind, but I'm also thinking about some object, in fact, that exists.
Sure. I mean, you think of the object presumably by having some mental representation of the Eiffel Tower going through your head, whatever that means. Okay, so if you think of the Eiffel Tower, you're thinking of something. Think of Sherlock Holmes. I take it you can. Take it you are. Are you thinking of something?
Well, not in the same way, is what I would be inclined to say. In that, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, I'm entertaining a concept. Perhaps I have certain descriptions and qualitative features in mind, but there's no object. There's no sort of like intentional object. There's nothing there that I'm, in fact, getting at or in the world.
Well, we agree on that because you're not thinking of something that exists. Okay, but that's a cheap shot.
Right.
Prima facie, when you think of the Eiffel Tower, that's a relationship between you and the Eiffel Tower. How it's realized will be to do with what's going on in your head, and that's true. Now,
Right.
Prima facie, at least, when you think of Sherlock Holmes, that's a relationship between you and Sherlock Holmes. Okay. If that's not the case, how do I understand that claim? And what's its semantics? It's not of the form one object relates to another object. What is it saying?
Yeah, so I think it's somewhat of a complicated issue, but as a sort of brief first pass, again, I think that in that case, what we can say is, when I'm thinking about Sherlock Holmes, there seems to me there are a few sort of paraphrases that we can give that don't require the existence of, or the presence.
Yeah, look, many people have suggested paraphrases. The question is whether they're adequate.
Right.
Look, when you think of something, you may not even know whether it exists. Okay, so think of Homer. Now, we don't know whether Homer existed or not, but certainly phenomenologically, what's going on in your head is exactly the same, whether you're thinking of Homer or the Eiffel Tower or Sherlock Holmes. So phenomenologically, the kind of existential status is irrelevant to your phenomenology. So
Right.
now I ask the question in terms of semantics. Now I'm asking in terms of phenomenology, but they're kind of much the same question. How am I to understand this when prima facie it's the same thing that's going on in all these cases, yet you want to draw distinctions amongst this? So that the challenge is to make sense of the distinctions you want to draw in a way that respects the semantics and the phenomenology of the situation. I mean, of course, many people have suggested ways you can do this. But then we come to the question of how you do that. Let's put it this way. I mean, what I'm suggesting is the most simple-minded and natural way of understanding this. You want to suggest something that's more complex, and maybe that's the right thing to do. Look, when we consider things like verbs like think of, worship, admire, these intentional verbs, they all appear to be mental states that are directed towards objects. How do you understand these things? And there are several possibilities. One is that they are indeed always states that are directed towards objects, some of which may or may not exist. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is there's some kind of paraphrase that means you don't take them at face value. The thought that these really are states that are directed towards objects, some of which exist and some of which don't, is certainly the simplest solution. It may not be the correct one, but it's certainly the simplest. So, if one doesn't think that is right, then two things. The first is that what is the alternative suggestion, and does that stack up to analysis, or are they sort of fairly damning objections? Secondly, if you don't want to accept the simplest account, why not? So there better be some pretty good objections against that view. And then the question is, what are those? Okay. Now, as I said, those are not rhetorical questions. I mean, they're serious questions which deserve to be addressed, but those are the questions which have to be addressed. Okay, so that's where debate goes.
Great. I mean, those are great questions. I take it that in making progress and deciding between different models, there we're going to be comparing and contrasting the different virtues of those theories, and so some of those virtues are going to be related to simplicity, according with our sort of prima facie intuitions, whatever. But also some of them are going to be like ontological simplicity, and that's something that might count against some of those. So where we come out in the end is going to require a lot of discussion, obviously.
But yeah, that's absolutely true. Remember though that Occam's razor says that entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, and there's a question of what necessity is here. Look, let me just make one other comment. Yeah, I mean, you're probably well aware of it, but let me just point this out. The view that some objects don't exist has been in bad taste in philosophy for most of the 20th century, because it's usually reckoned it was trashed by Russell and later by Quine. And that the view is usually attributed to Meinong, who was some kind of loony, and Russell and Quine restored common sense. This is a perverted view of the history of philosophy and logic, because Meinong held a very orthodox view that was common to most logicians and metaphysicians for the 2,000 years before Meinong. And it was Russell and Quine who held the sort of deviant view historically. So as a matter of fact, the way I read the history of philosophy now is that the view is starting to swing back towards this more old-fashioned view. And it's Russell and Quine who held the historically aberrant view. And we might go into whether their arguments were any good. That's another story. But at least, painting Meinong as this kind of loony, as the picture you get from Quine, is just a distorted view of the history of philosophy and the history of logic.
Fair enough. I think we'll move on now to some other text questions. We had one from someone asking about the relation of logic to to quantum mechanics, and they're asking,
Oh.
do you think that quantum mechanics entails a violation of the law of non-contradiction? Many scientists, like Lawrence Krauss, give the impression that quantum mechanics and quantum logic prove that it is not true. Do you think this is evidence for dialetheism?
Look, I'm not an expert in quantum mechanics. What I know is very limited, but to the extent that I understand it, the answer is no. At least with the present understanding of quantum mathematics. I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't change in the next 100 years. It would be kind of surprising if it didn't, but at least at the moment, the answer is no. I mean, there is this thing called quantum logic, but quantum logic isn't dialethic. And as far as I understand it, the company you get in quantum physics do not require dialetheism.
I think that's correct, yeah. So we had a voice question from Dan P. If you want to unmute, you can ask a question.
All right, can I just check that you can hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so one of the things I'm interested in is the normative role that logic plays, it might be thought, in our rational economy. And so for this reason, I've been looking at doubt truth to be a liar. Now, operating under a classical framework, so with classical notions of logical consequence, validity, and so on, there are some serious problems with supposing that we're rationally obligated to maintain a consistent belief set. And your solution to these problems is, of course, to kind of wag the finger at classical logic and kind of advocate paraconsistent logic instead. But I'm wondering whether the resulting norms on reasoning, which I take to kind of include belief revision and that kind of thing, are strict enough. So, I mean, I take it that we want to say it's irrational to entertain at least some inconsistent beliefs. But, maybe some politician publicly endorses two propositions which have some further corollary, which the politician refuses to endorse. And it seems that we can levy some kind of criticism against the politician. They've violated some rational norm. So I guess my question is, can we generate norms that are strict enough if we use paraconsistent consequence relations?
Are you suggesting that any set of rules out contradictions a priori are necessary, otherwise they're not going to be strict enough?
Sorry, you just cut out for a second on my end. Unnecessary, necessarily what?
Yeah. Was that any norms that doesn't rule out all contradictions can't be strict enough? Is that the point?
I'm not sure it's just me, but I think your microphone might be cutting out. So did you say that? Okay, so yeah. So did you? So my point was under your kind of proposed kind of conditions for or system, I suppose, of revising belief, is it that any kind of inconsistent belief set is it that inconsistency is never kind of disallowed, or are there certain conditions under which it's still you're still violating some rational norms by maintaining inconsistent belief sets?
Of course. Look, it may be that any inconsistency is logically possible, but then it's logically possible that you could jump up into the air and hover there for 15 minutes. I mean, logical possibility is weak. Okay, rationality goes a long way beyond logicality, and the fact that someone holds a view logically consistent does not make it rational. Okay, then we come to talk about what makes things rational, and some views are much more irrational than some contradictions. So, for example, the view that Donald Trump is a fried egg is perfectly consistent. It's highly irrational.
All right, so I had a question about that relates to your 2002 paper called Rational Dilemmas. in which you argued that there are some cases, at least, where rationality requires forming the impossible. And you use Newcomb's problem as an example. So in the case you, or reason you provide for choosing both boxes, on that, why would we treat the value in the box as a rigid designator, given that it's known to correlate with your choice that you make?
Why should that prevent it being a rigid designator?
Whether it can count as a rigid designator, I'm not sure. Maybe I'd have to think about it, but it seems to me that when you're deliberating over your choices, you might want to think about which outcomes are more likely on those different options you take, and taking the value as fixed in that deliberation might kind of goes against that reasoning.
Shall I see that? Look, suppose tomorrow's my partner's birthday, and I give her a present. Okay, I haven't decided what to give her yet. Maybe chocolate, flowers. But whichever it is, I'll go up and I'll buy it and I'll give it to her. All right. Now, I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I rigidly designate that thing, say, Dana. And I don't know what Dana refers to yet because I haven't bought it, but tomorrow I will. And Dana is not a definite description. I fix the referent of Dana by a definite description, but Dana is a rigid designator for that thing. So if you read, say, Kripke, when he talks about rigid designation, he points out that it's perfectly fine to fix something, to single something out by a definite description, and then to refer to it rigidly. And that's essentially what I'm doing. So I single out this thing by a definite description, namely the thing I'm going to buy tomorrow. Obviously, what that thing is depends on my choice, but having singled it out with that definite description, I can then refer to it rigidly. So I don't see why the fact that what it is depends on my choice means I can't rigidly refer to it.
Yeah, but no, the idea is that sure, we could have we could rigidly refer to it, but why is that sort of useful for determining what we should do in that case?
Well, okay, remember that you've got an argument that says you should choose one box, and you've got an argument that you should choose two boxes. Now, in that paper, which I haven't read for a long time, so I'm racking my brains rapidly, I give an argument for both. Okay, and the context of rigid designation comes up because one might object to one of these arguments because the thing is not a rigid because if the thing is not a rigid designator, the argument doesn't work. And so the reply is, maybe that's true if the argument's not a rigid designator, but now let's consider the argument where it is a rigid designator, the argument goes through. So it's part of a reply to an objection to the argument I give. And the replies of the form, yeah, if it's not a rigid designator, maybe it doesn't work. But now let's consider the argument where it is a rigid designator, and then it works. So that's the relevance.
All right, and sort of a follow-up on that is a sort of a criticism of the conditionals that you assert in that.
Right.
In that argument, what if in the case where the predictor is like infallible, it always gets it right? Is the conditional where, because then we would presume that the indicative conditional where if you choose Well, I guess the indicative conditional is still going to be true, right? In that if you choose both boxes, then you'll get what's in the opaque box plus 10 or C plus 10, whatever. But all the same, you know that what that value is going to be is $10 in total. And whereas if you were to take only one box, you would know that you get $100 in total.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's just rehearsing one horn of the dilemma. Of course, that's true. But now, I mean, what about the other horn of the dilemma? I mean, it's not good enough to resolve a dilemma by just endorsing one of the horns. Okay, you've got to say what's wrong with the other one.
I mean, I guess that would undermine using those indicative conditionals in determining what the rational choice is. But if you want to say that, well, but why would that reason take precedence over this one, I guess, is what your point is. And so that...
No. I mean, why would it undermine it? Look, the other horn of the dilemma has a conditional as well. But that conditional seems to be equally true. That's the problem. So there are conditionals in both horns of the dilemma, and there are good reasons for supposing that both conditionals are true. That's the problem.
All right, sounds good.
So you've got to explain. You've got to not to solve the dilemma, to get rid of the dilemma. You've got to not only endorse one horn of it. You've got to explain what's wrong with the other one. That's where the real action is.
Right. Yeah. And I guess there's more work to be done there.
Yeah. Look, I'm not saying these things can't be done. You know, all these things are going to be contentious. It's good to be clear about what really needs to be done to resolve the dilemma.
Fair enough. I'll move on to another text question from Verbal Siege Engine, who's wondering, do you think that the criticisms of the analytic synthetic distinction have been successful in showing that the distinction is artificial or problematic?
Okay. First of all, is my mic still cutting out, or are we good now?
No, it seems good now.
Okay. All right. So, no, I don't think that the critiques of the analytic synthetic distinction work. I think they're just wrong.
Right. So you think, so for example, especially with Quine, I mean, you have that older paper now, something like 2 Dogmas of Quineanism or something like that.
Yeah. No, I stand by most of that.
All right, great.
And there aren't many things in which I find myself in the position of orthodoxy. But, you know, rejecting the analytic synthetic distinction was certainly pretty orthodox in the 1960s, 1970s. My take on where things are now in analytic philosophy is that most people accept the analytic synthetic distinction in at least some form. People argue about what grounds it. But I don't think many people now feel embarrassed about the distinction in the way they did 40 years ago. That's a kind of subjective appraisal of the current state of analytic philosophy.
Do you have a particular view on what grounds it, or?
Yeah, a very old-fashioned one, the meanings of words.
Fair enough. We had another question from DE, who was wondering, if we're using paraconsistent logics, does this mean that contradictions are contingently false, if false?
I'm inclined to think that some dialethias are necessarily true and some are only contingently true. And flip that over for falsity. So things like the liar paradox, I'm inclined to think, are necessarily contradictory. But I think that, for example, inconsistent laws give rise to dialethias in some contexts, but those depend on certain contingent facts. And so if you get dialethias in a legal context, those are going to be contingently true. So the status of a dialethia could be necessary, or it could be contingent.
Right, so it's just going to depend on which statements we're talking
Which
about.
dialethia you're talking about. Yes, absolutely.
Another question from Jorha on dialethia. What kind of methods do we have to find or prove which things are true and false?
Okay. Same as any other claim to truth. I mean, how do you know when something? When is it reason to believe that something's true? Okay. Obviously, that's a contentious question, but I think Hume got it pretty much right when he said that the rational person is a person who apportions their beliefs according to the evidence, and that's quite general, and it applies to contradictory truths in as much as it applies to non-contradictory truths. You look at the evidence. So, for example, if you take the liar paradox, you look at the arguments that are being given for the liar paradox. You see whether you can break them in any plausible way. If you can't, then the evidence points in their favor. All right. So that's the sort of evidence that the liar sentence is true and false. Now let's take another contradiction. Donald Trump is a frog and not a frog. Well, I know what the evidence is that he's not a frog. Well, give me the evidence that he's a frog. Don't know very good evidence for that. There's no reason to believe that contradiction is true. Are you going to have to do this on a case-by-case basis? Yep, afraid so.
Seems reasonable enough. DE actually had a follow-up on that previous question. So if we took some example like that, say Donald Trump is a frog and not a frog, that we take to be false, of course. Is that the sort of thing that could be only contingently false?
Contingent in which sense of necessity? So words like necessary, possible, contingent can mean many different things, right? So when we're talking about the contingency of that, which sense of necessity are we talking about?
Probably have to be some like logical or paraconsistent notion. I'm not sure.
Okay, Donald Trump is a frog and not a frog. That is false. If it were necessarily true in any sense, because a conjunction is necessarily true if and only if both conjuncts are, Donald Trump is a frog would have to be necessary truth. Is there any sense of necessity in which that could be a necessary truth? I can't think of one.
Yeah, fair enough. It seems difficult to think about. Did you want to say something more on that, or do you mind moving on to another question?
No, I don't mind moving on. I mean, a lot of the questions that are being asked are very good. Let me say that when I agreed to do this, I was kind of skeptical that people would ask meaningful, sensible questions, and the questions that are being asked are actually very good. But that's just an aside.
Thanks. Yeah.
Most of the questions, because they're good questions, are going to be such that there's always going to be room for further discussion and debate, as there always is in philosophy. And so, a lot of my answers won't end discussion, but there reaches a certain point where they invite the questioner to come back with, say more about what you think. And that's, we've reached that point with that last question.
Fair enough. So we had a question from someone who was wondering, what is the outlook on becoming a pure logician from a philosophy background alone? Every logician I learn about through self-study turns out to at least have a BA level math background.
It's true, a lot do. Not all do. Even some quite technical logicians don't have a background, a heavy math background. I'll give you my favourite example. There's a British logician called Wilfred Hodges, who I know because he taught me way back when I was a student. Wilfred did an undergraduate degree in theology, but he ceased to be a Christian a few weeks before his finals. So theology ceased to be rather important to him, so he switched to philosophy. He got a job as a philosopher. He started teaching logic. He didn't have the math background, but he acquired it. And he then moved into mathematics and did a lot of very good work in technical mathematical logic. Okay, so his sort of trajectory is very unusual, but it illustrates the point that you can become a very good mathematical logician without having an undergraduate degree in mathematics.
Right. Oh, and they also wanted to add that your intro to non-classical logic is wonderfully written. I really enjoyed that book.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to hear. I mean, I never wanted to write a textbook. I just got fed up with the fact there wasn't one available. And when I was teaching logic, I had to refer people to the research literature, which is not a great way to teach undergraduate logic. So in the end, I decided to write it with the aim of making it easier for people to learn non-classical logic. And if it helps people to do that, I'm really happy.
Awesome. We had another text question from Verbal Siege Engine, who was wondering, if the liar paradox is a dialethia, should we also consider so-called revenge arguments as dialethia? For example, and this this is written down in the channel, but it says like statement I 2 + 2 = 4, statement I 2 + 2 = 5, and statement I most Roman numeral sentences in this post are true.
Yeah.
So whether 3 is true depends on whether
the third one is a tiebreaker and it pushes both ways. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, I wouldn't call that a revenge paradox, but it's certainly a paradox. And I guess I think that it's both true and false, the third sentence.
Is the reason to thinking that it's both true and false is that we have no reason to prefer thinking that it's true over false? Or
no.
Why think that it's...
Well, okay, if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. Like the liar paradox.
Oh, right. Okay.
And assuming that it's either true or false, you've got a contradiction. Now, of course, many people try to get out of the paradoxes by rejecting the excluded middle in that context. But I kind of like the law of excluded middle, so that's why I think it's both true and false.
I had a somewhat unrelated question about tense and truth conditions. You have a paper on that from some time ago.
You bring up some very old papers of mine.
Well, I won't look at it for anything specific in the paper, but I was just wondering about what your if you have any thoughts on sort of truth conditions on like A-theory views of time or like presentism. If there's any issues there, or is that like a pseudo problem?
Yeah, okay. Time is hard. And I confess that this is something I change my mind on frequently. That paper that you're referring to, if I remember right, was written in response to a paper by an old friend of mine who's now dead, Hugh Muller. And the point there was simply that Hugh gave an argument for the B theory or against the A theory. And my point was simply that the argument didn't work because you could sort of rejig it so that it cut both ways. So that wasn't an argument for either the A theory or the B theory. It was just pointing out that I didn't think that particular argument worked. Okay, so what do I think? My sort of gut reaction is that I'm an A theorist, a B theorist, beg your pardon. But the big problem for the B theorist is how to explain a phenomenology of the flow of time, because time doesn't flow if you're a B theorist. And that's a serious problem, I think. Now, the standard B theorist answer is that the flow of time is an illusion. Phenomenologically, that's just crazy. Okay. So there's a question about how to account for the phenomenology of the flow of time if you're an A theorist, without totally trashing this and saying that it's an illusion. I'm not sure that I have an answer to that I find very persuasive, but I do think it's closely connected with the dialethia involved in motion and contradictory states that constitute motion, and by extension, the contradictory nature of time. So the basic thought is that when you describe the flow of time, it's hard not to be driven into contradiction. Well, that's a standard enough view. But then the thought is that these contradictions are sort of constitutive of the phenomenology of the flow of time. Okay, there are a lot of gaps in that argument, but that's what I'm inclined to think. So to sort of summarize that, I guess I'm an A theorist who thinks that, I'm a B theorist who thinks that A theory intuitions can be accommodated dialethically.
Interesting. You also mentioned there, paradoxes of motion. You take it that certain statements involving motion, like in Zeno's paradoxes and other things, are genuine dialethia, or is that
some of them?
Not your view?
Yeah. The four standard paradoxes of motion of Zeno, I think the only serious one is the arrow. And I do think that the best response to that is a dialethic one, as did various philosophers in the history of philosophy, such as Hegel.
Right. Let's see. We had another question from Dan P on the logical belief revision, where he asked, the AGM account of belief revision represents beliefs by sentences in some formal language. But according to orthodoxy, the objects of beliefs are propositions. Is this a reason for thinking that the AGM account might be defective, or is there some way of finessing the problem?
Okay, let's take a step back. Virtually the whole of modern logic assumes that truth bearers are sentences of some formal language or other. That's a kind of methodological assumption that logicians make. It's kind of contentious, but most logicians would think it's a fairly harmless assumption, because if you take your truth bearers to be other things like propositions, you can just rejig the machinery to do it. Now, certainly it's true that the AGM account makes this assumption, this standard assumption, but I think if you think that it's propositions which are the primary bearers of truth, you could actually rejig the AGM machinery to take account of this. So if you think that propositions are the primary bearers of truth, you're certainly going to take it that sentences can express propositions and therefore are true or false in a kind of secondary sense. And so I think your operations on the truth bearers in this secondary sense would just project to the operations of the truth bearers in the primary sense. So I don't think that, I mean, if you take propositions to be the primary bearers of truth, I don't think it's going to seriously problematize the AGM account.
All right. Sounds good. We had a voice question from David Lee Roth, if you want to.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Priest. Sorry, Graham. That's how you prefer.
That's fine.
And I hope my microphone is working. Yes. So I wanted to, I wanted to ask about what you said earlier. Basically, which was you basically kind of had a pun on this feminist slogan. Which part of no don't you understand? Right. So you'll say something like, you understand all of. Yeah. So you brought an example of a very simple dialethia. As an example, and you said, okay, you understand this word, you understand that word, you understand that word. So that's the problem, and that's where I wanted to follow it up. I guess. So, does it mean that if something is a dialethia, it has contradictory properties? And if something has contradictory properties, how can anything have contradictory properties? Isn't having a contradictory properties an impossibility? So, for example, if the sun has the property of not shining, how can it also have the property of shining at the same time in the exact same sense? Or, that was, I believe, the example you used. So can you break that down in, for example, the terms that are perhaps easier to understand of how this can work? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Look, it's a good question, although I don't think it's got much to do with what I said about meaning, because that question about meaning spun off the thought that contradictions are meaningless, whereas what you're pushing on is not the thought they're meaningless, it's the thought that they're true, and that your problem is how could they possibly be true, and it's. If a contradiction is true, then something's got contradictory properties. It may not, I mean, it's not the statement that, so let's take a silly example. The sun is shining and not shining. It's not that statement which has contradictory properties, it's the sun. Okay, and if dialethias are true, it certainly says that some things have contradictory properties, so something will satisfy the property P and something will satisfy the property not P. And your question is, how can that be the case? That's the focus of your question. Okay, good. So what you're raising is a question about the semantics of negation. Now, suppose you think that the negation of a sentence or property can be true if and only if the thing in itself fails to be true. Then if the sun is shining and not shining, then the sun both shines and fails to be shining. And that's kind of hard to see how that could be the case. But typically in a paraconsistent logic, that's not how the semantics of negation work. So in classical logic, and the talk about failure is gesturing at the counter of negation you get in classical logic. There are only two possibilities, true only and false only. But in the semantics of paraconsistent logics, there's a third possibility, both. And in some paraconsistent logics, there's a fourth possibility, neither. Okay. So in those semantics, things might be true only, false only, both, or neither. All right. That's not an orthodox view. But once you've got your head around that possibility, the rest of negation works as you might learn in logic 100. Namely, negation is something that flips the sentence from the truths to the falses and the falses to the truths. So something which is true and false is simply something which is one of these guys which is both true and false. That is, for something in that category, both P and not P are true. All right, so if you've never met a paraconsistent logic before, and you've only ever met classical logic, then the thought that something can be both true and false will be a kind of a radical view on one you're not used to operating with. How do you get used to operating with it? Well, you learn a different logical theory. So you have to learn how negation works in a paraconsistent logic. That's going to be a different theory of negation. Once you get your head around that, you can see how negation works in this way. So if you're having problems about understanding how this works, then you've got to get your head around a different theory of negation. But you can do that. Logicians do. They learn how different theories of negation work, say in paraconsistent logic and intuitionistic logic. So this is possible. It requires work. But you've got to put the work in to get your head around these different possibilities. I mean, let me give you an analogy. When the special theory of relativity was first mooted, lots of people said, look, I really can't understand what it will be for time to, for difference to be spatial in one frame of reference and temporal in another. I just don't understand that. They didn't understand it because, of course, it's a nonsense in Newtonian dynamics. But, of course, once they sort of started to understand how special relativity works, then it all started to make sense to them. So something that appeared crazy just because it was ruled out by the framework started to make more sense when they learnt the new framework. And what I'm saying to you is that if this thought that something might be true and false, or something its negation might be true, doesn't make sense, you've got to get your head around a new framework. But you can do that if you work at it. I don't know if that answers your question or whether I've gone just way past the point.
So again, for me, I don't want to sound repetitive because I'm sure you've heard this a lot of times, but well, first of all, I would like to ask, what is an example of something that you consider to have contradictory properties? And secondly, why shouldn't we think that there is, for example, mistake in our reasoning when we encounter such paradoxes, rather than assume that they are dialethia? Thank you. That will be my final.
So an example is the liar sentence. It's both true and false. Now, why shouldn't you think there's a mistake in the reasoning? Well, tell me what it is.
Well, we could use the example of Saul Kripke, which says that the liar paradox isn't a sentence since it's ungrounded. And I'm sure there have been other solutions that I'm less familiar with.
Okay, no, that's not quite Saul's solution. Saul says that it's neither true nor false. Actually, if you read Saul's paper carefully, what he says is in the fixed point that his model generates, it's neither true nor false. But he realizes that there's an issue with this solution because there seem to be things which we say which are true, which are neither true nor false in the fixed point. So he says that the ghost of Tarski is still with us, okay? And he still maintains that view because we taught a course on truth a couple of years ago, and we talked a lot about this. Okay, so look, the general point is that many people, not just Saul, have suggested that you can get out of the liar paradox by supposing that things are neither true nor false. And there are very well-known objections to this view, namely, it is apparently subject to revenge paradoxes, things like this sentence is either false or neither true nor false. So, suggested solutions to the liar paradox are legion. Logicians have been suggesting these things for over 2,000 years now. All of them have problems. This is witnessed by the fact that after 2,000 years of people suggesting solutions, there is still no consensus on the matter. So,
wait, what about like Arthur Pryor's solution, where you would say that, well, like every proposition like assumes its own truth value, so saying the statement is false is really to just say that the statement is both true and false. And so since true contradiction, like under classical logic, you can't have true contradictions, you just say that it's false, that the statement is false.
right, so it's false. But it says it's false, so it's true. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, the idea is that it's saying that it's both true and false, right? That's the implied meaning of the sentence. Right,
If
but
it's
you
both
would
true
say
and
that
false. Sorry, if it's both true and false, it's false. And it says it's false, so it's true. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, the thing is, like, the solution would say that it's actually not just saying that it's false. It's saying that it's both true and false, right?
But if it's both true and false, then it's false. If you're round and square, you're round. Or if you're round and red, you're round. Okay?
Yeah.
I had a very different question, if we're fine to move on, about...
I mean, I'm fine to move on. I'm not sure your questions are.
Fair enough. So I had a question about vagueness, and you have at least one paper, perhaps several, but one from 2010 called Enclosures, Vagueness, and Self-Reference, in which you argue for a dialethic solution to varieties and other similar paradoxes of enclosure. Are the inconsistencies here taken to be a statement about language, like we make statements which are inconsistent, or are they also about things, like in sense we can infer that they're inconsistent objects?
If something is true, then generally speaking, that's a result of two things: the meanings of the words of the statement involved and the world that the statement describes. And there can be sort of degenerate cases where only the meanings are involved. We talked about the case of analyticity earlier. But in general, both these things are going to be important. So in the case of vagueness, so let's suppose you've got a borderline case. So you've got this kind of Sorites transition. Maybe it's colors. Maybe it goes from red to not red. You've got this borderline case where the thing in question is both red and not red. Now, that's true. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the solution is dialethic. Of course, the question was about the status in that case. So let's assume that that's a dialethia. Now, is that true because of the meanings of the words red, or because of the nature of the object in question? And the answer has to be both, I think.
Yeah, I think I expected that response, but I was just wondering anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how much of my answer you missed. Go on.
No. If you wanted to follow up on that, because my next question was sort of unrelated. So if you wanted to say something more about that.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, the way you phrased your question, it gave me a dilemma, a dichotomy, and I'm not sure that I buy into that dichotomy.
Oh, I thought I had said that if it was merely this, or if it's... I thought I left it open that it could have been both. But
all right.
Maybe I misphrased it.
Well, maybe I misunderstood. Okay, but then, I mean, I think we can probably go on to the next question in that case.
Sure. So I had a question about like ontological commitment, and what your, if you have one, view is on sort of criteria of ontological commitment. Do you think do you accept something like Quine's criterion or something else?
a preliminary question. What do you mean by ontological commitment? Do you mean what things do I recognize as objects, or what things do I recognize as existent? Because I don't think those are
yes,
equivalent.
of course. Right, on your view. I suppose we might want the criteria for each, or maybe one general criteria that might entail commitment to one of those. I don't know.
Okay, so let's take the object question first. When do I think a person is committed to something as being an object? When they endorse sentences which refer to it, quantify over it, or in any other way treat it as an object. That's not a very good way of putting it. That's big the question. Let's just stick to the Quinean criterion for the moment. If you can quantify over it, it's an object. Okay. So in that sense, I'd be a Quinean. Of course, Quine thinks that if you quantify over it, it's not just an object, it's an existent object. So when do I think you're committed to something as an existent object? When you endorse some view according to which it's both an object and is engaged, or at least has the potential to enter into causal interactions.
So you would say then that things which don't engage or have the potential to engage in causal interactions are not existent?
Yeah.
So, because some people, I think a lot of people would say that abstracta exist, but they don't enter into causal relations.
This is true. This is a view, and if you think that some objects don't exist, you might well think that abstract objects are not of that kind. You might be a Platonist, for example. So the view that some things don't exist does not commit you to this view of abstract objects. And if push comes to shove, I could be persuaded to be a Platonist, but all things considered, it seems to me simpler, if you think that some objects don't exist, to suppose that abstract objects are of this kind. At the very least, what it needs, I guess, what it would need to persuade me of this is a good argument to suppose that abstract objects exist, not simply that they're objects, but that they're existent objects. And I don't mean by that they enter into causal relations. I don't think this is a definition of existence. It's simply a criterion. So what I'm asking for is a kind of Platonist argument, an argument to suppose that abstract objects are existent. And again, that's not a rhetorical question. That's an honest question. I mean, why should I suppose, given that I think that some objects don't exist, that abstract objects are objects that do exist?
So you think we can get them to do the work we require of them without them being existent objects, more or less? Sure.
I mean, why might you suppose they're existent objects? It ain't going to be they enter into causal interactions, presumably. So it's got to be something else that they're doing which tells you they're existent. So what is it about abstract objects which requires the assumption that they exist? Okay, and that's an honest question.
Yeah, I think perhaps what some people have in mind, at least implicitly, is the idea that, well, I don't think that you can pull apart whether something's an object or whether it exists. And so insofar as I think they're objects, I think they exist. But maybe if they did think there was some distinction there, they might be open to the view that they're non-existent objects.
Oh, so if you reject the distinction between being an object and being an existent object, and you think they're objects, you think they're existent objects. So whether there's a distinction between existing objects and objects is an important question, and we can go into the arguments. Well, in fact, we did in part go into some of the arguments for that when we talked about intentional objects, right? So that issue is there, but I was assuming, at least for the present issue, that you can make good that distinction. And then the question comes why you should put abstract objects on one particular side of that distinction. So that's the second issue.
Right, that makes sense. Move on to another question from Foxo, who's wondering, what are some of your thoughts on determinism and free will, do you think?
Yeah, okay. I guess I think that many things that people choose to do, they choose to do freely, which is not to say they're uncaused.
Is that a sort of compatibilism you might be okay?
Yeah, I'm a sort of compatibilist, but I'm aware. I'm aware of the problems with the compatibilist view, but I'm inclined to be a compatibilist. Just to put some background on this, it's kind of interesting that problems of free will really enter Western philosophy around the turn of the scientific revolution. I mean, there are problems of God's foreknowledge before that, but the incompatibility between determinism and free will seems to enter around the scientific revolution. And I rather suspect that it's because a certain notion of causation enters philosophical discourse or orthodoxy around the turn of the scientific revolution. It's sort of the billiard ball model of causation. So I think that the problem between causation and free will may be a product of this sort of billiard ball model of causation. And the billiard ball model of causation has pretty much gone out of, is pretty much defunct in modern physics. So I rather suspect that the supposed problems between determinism and free will are a problem of this model of causation, which is inappropriate. Okay, so that's very big picture stuff, and there are lots of things there that are kind of need to be fleshed out at much greater length. But the bottom line is, yeah, I'm a compatibilist, and I'm a soft determinist to compatibilist.
Yeah, I have a question when we can get to me.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. Dr. Priest, I also wanted to ask, among there has been a lack of research about this, basically in philosophy, but among your colleagues, how widespread is paraconsistent logic? Would you say that it's becoming more and more customary for people to be willing to accept dialetheism, for example? Like, as far as statistics is concerned, what's your take?
Yeah, okay, well, that's an interesting sociological question. Let's distinguish first between paraconsistency and dialetheism. One is a view about the nature of logical consequence, and one is a view about the nature of truth. And these are not unconnected, but they're different questions. So let's take the question about paraconsistency first. And many paraconsistent logicians, maybe most paraconsistent logicians, are not dialetheists. They think that contradictions don't imply everything. They don't think that contradictions might be true. Okay. Now, most logicians nowadays will recognize paraconsistent logic as a kind of possible account of logical consequence. And they're quite happy to play with it, maybe invoke it sometimes, have it as a position in logical space. When it comes to it, most logicians are technicians. And if they've got something interesting to play with technically, they're cool with it. And, so The number of logicians will tell you that paraconsistent logic is the one and only truth about logic. There aren't many of those around. But most logicians are kind of instrumentalists, and they'll just use whatever logical machinery they find helps. So, in summary, paraconsistent logic is, a well-recognized logic on the scene, like intuitionism and many-valued logic and modal logic. And most logicians will be happy to, investigate these various possibilities. Okay, dialetheism is a different matter. As I said, most paraconsistent logicians are not dialetheists. All right, now, how many dialetheists are in the world? Well, there was a time when there were two of us, myself and Richard Routley, or Sylvan, as he became known. Richard is now sadly dead, so that reduces the number to one. Okay, of the original dialetheists. But there are a lot of people who are dialetheists now. For people I know, probably at least a dozen practicing philosophers who are dialetheists. And of course, I don't know a lot of philosophers. So those are just a dozen or so I could give you names of. I'm sure there are many more than that. In some sense, but there's another question you might ask. How many people are there who are prepared to give it the time of day? And that is quite a lot. So when Richard and I started pushing dialetheism, to give it the time of day, and that is quite a lot. So when Richard and I started pushing dialetheism in the 70s, most philosophers thought this was so absurd that it was just not worth considering. And many philosophers now, especially those who have sort of engaged with the issues, may not be dialetheists, but they recognize it as a possible position in philosophical space, as it were. And there are quite a lot of philosophers who are like that. So how many paid up dialetheists are there in the world? Well, at least a dozen, maybe an awful lot more. How many people are there who recognize it as a view in logical space, like, say, intuitionism? Quite a lot, I think.
All right. I had another question about logic, and in particular about counterfactual conditionals. How do you think we should evaluate the truth of such statements? And in particular, do you think there's a plausibility in David Lewis's influential model?
Well, look, counterfactuals, if you mean counterfactual, are not a kind of conditional at all. Counterfactual is just where the antecedent is not true. And that's not a natural kind. If there's a natural kind, and it's between things where you use the subjunctive and things where you use the indicative in the antecedent. Okay, now David Lewis thought that there was a natural kind distinction there, so that indicatives get one kind of analysis, subjunctives get another kind. Other logicians have disagreed with that. So Bob Stornacker, for example, thinks that there's only one kind of conditional there. I guess I'm on the Stornacker side of this debate. But all kinds of there's only one semantics for all kinds of conditionals, and it's a world semantics. And where you find differences between the examples that are supposed to establish that there are differences of kind, such as the Oswald Kennedy examples, that distinction is to be explained by something else that's going on. It's not to do with indicative, subjunctive. It's something else, and we can go into that if you like. But I mean that's my view.
So, like, to take an example, then, if you were to evaluate some conditional, like I don't know, had Kennedy not been shot, then I don't know, insert something about what we think might have happened in his presidency later on. How would we evaluate the truth of that sort of statement?
Well, when you evaluate a conditional, you think of those worlds or situations where the antecedent is true, but you always need more than that. You need to carry over some information from the actual world. I mean, information from the actual world has to bleed over to add to the antecedent to get you anywhere, right? And what everyone will agree with is that what information bleeds over is context dependent.
There's no hard and fast answer to that. It's going to be what we include in the antecedent is going to be somewhat subjective or context dependent.
That's not really contentious because of things like, if Caesar had been in command in the Korean War, he'd have used catapults. If Caesar had been in command in the Korean War, he'd have used atomic bombs. I mean, everyone agrees that which of those is true will depend on context, whether you're talking about, what else you're assuming about Caesar being around during the Korean War. So the context dependent of these things is not controversial. The view that you can explain the difference in contextually dependent terms is more controversial. But I mean, let's talk about the Oswald Kennedy examples a bit more. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, someone else did. Okay, that's the indicative, right?
Right. That we think is
So
true.
we look at those. Yeah, that one is true. How do you get to that? Well, you consider situations where Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy. You bleed over the information that Kennedy was shot, and it follows that somebody else did. Okay, good. Now, what about the other one? If Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have. Well, there's a tense issue there for a start. There's a kind of backshift phenomenon which says that's really the past tense of if Oswald doesn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else will, as uttered on that fateful day in Dallas before the assassination. Okay, so if you evaluate that conditional at that time, and you bleed over the information that Oswald acts alone, then the consequent is false. Because if Oswald doesn't shoot Kennedy, someone else will is then false. So notice that in the indicative of the conjunctive, there's not only a time shift, but there's also a matter of the information that bleeds over. And given the context in which we normally use these conditionals, that bleed over is natural. However, you can sort of tweak the context in such a way that it's natural to bleed over different things. You've got to work at it, but it's possible, I think. And so the difference is explicable by, first of all, the backshift thesis, and secondly, what it is that you're bleeding over into the hypothetical situation. Sorry, is that any clearer? Apologies for garbling it first time.
No, that's helpful. Yeah. So I had just another question about logic. What do you think the applicability of like fuzzy logics is? Do you think they're useful in?
Yeah. So by a fuzzy logic, I take it you mean a logic where truth comes by degrees, maybe between 0 and 1.
Right.
Yeah. I think they're kind of interesting. Like most logicians, I'm happy to play with these things just as technical issues. If they have a good application, then presumably it's to do with vagueness. And there was a time when I thought that that probably was the best way to handle vagueness and Sorites paradoxes. I guess I changed my mind about that for various reasons, which we can go into if you like. But I think the most natural applications of fuzzy logics now is better handled by dialetheism. So I kind of like fuzzy logics, but I don't think that the most plausible application is best handled by a fuzzy logic.
How do you propose handling paradoxes of self-reference in general? Like I know you have some examples, you just take a dialectic solution, but what do you take as a general approach to paradoxes of self-reference?
Well, paradoxes of self-reference are not a natural kind. I think probably uncontentiously they fall into different kinds. So there are the ones you first think of, like the liar paradox. But for example, there's something called the surprise exam paradox.
Right.
So it's a paradox that uses backwards induction, essentially. So the kids in some class know there's going to be an exam on one day of the week, but they don't know when. And they know they don't know when. So they reason, look, if it gets to Friday morning and it hasn't happened, then we know it's going to be on Friday, so it can't be on Friday. Okay, so we can lock out Friday. Well, so let's suppose we get to Thursday morning, we know it can't be on Friday, hasn't happened, so it's got to be on Thursday, so we know it's going to happen, so it can't be Thursday, and then you do this backwards induction, and it can never happen. So this is the surprise exam paradox. And there are different ways of setting it up, but one way involves self-reference, namely there's going to be an exam, but you cannot deduce when it's going to be from this very information. Now, that's a way of setting up that involves self-reference, but it's obviously not in the same league as the liar, because even though it involves self-reference, the essence of the paradox is something to do with backwards induction. So paradoxes of self-reference do not form a natural kind, and I think that's pretty obvious once you start to think about the various kinds of ways that self-reference can enter into paradoxes.
Fair enough. Do you have a general view on natural kinds?
Yeah. I think they're natural kinds. I think water's a natural kind. I think that electricity is a natural kind. Maybe some species are natural kinds, not so sure about that. Natural kinds are defined by essences. So the essence of water is to be composed of H2O, right? But I don't take this to be an argument for metaphysical necessity, because I take these natural kinds to be physical necessities. I know a lot of people who believe in natural kinds take to be metaphysical necessities. I've never seen anything to speak really to that view. Whereas pretty obviously, if they're natural kinds, they're physically necessary. So that's my that's my view.
And just a question about another paradox. Do you think, how would you resolve or just respond to Curry's paradox?
Curry's paradox comes in various forms, but in all of them, some form of premise contraction is involved. Exactly how depends on the way you formulate which version of Curry's paradox you're dealing with. There are many different kinds, but I'm inclined to think that the best way to handle all the versions of Curry's paradox is to get rid of contraction, either in the antecedent of conditional or in the substructural rule of contraction. So I don't think it's in the same kind as the liar paradox, for example. So a moment ago we were talking about paradox of self-reference not being a natural kind. In my book, the Curry paradoxes are not of the same natural kind as the liar paradox. That's a much more contentious view. And I know that I think probably most logicians do think of Curry and the liar as forming a part of a natural kind. I mean, and I don't deny that that's a sort of the most common sense view. I just think it's wrong.
So for example, in some statements of Curry's paradox, we move from if X, then Y to if X, then Y by contraction. You would deny that step?
Essentially, yeah. Yes.
Right,
So Curry's paradox is a paradox of conditionality, not of negation. And okay, that needs to be explained in various ways. But as a first cut, that'll do. It's a paradox of conditionality, not a paradox of negation.
And you set up paradoxes of conditionality and negations as like different kinds or natural kinds of paradoxes. Is that?
Yeah, and in general, that's not contentious. I mean, no one thinks of the paradoxes of the material conditional as paradox of self-reference. I mean, I think of Curry paradoxes as more akin to the paradoxes of the material conditional than the paradoxes of like the liar, which, I mean, prima facie, that doesn't sound right. Okay, so I realize that view is counterintuitive and that needs careful defense.
All right. I think we're probably going to wrap it up around here, if that's all right with you.
That's fine. Yep.
Thanks so much for taking part and spending all this time to answer questions.
You're welcome. And let me reiterate what I said before. I mean, the questions that you and other people have been asking, I think, are very good. I've taken part in some of these Discord things before, and the questions were all over the place, and they were not very well informed. And this session has not been like that. So well done to you and the other people who've entered into the discussion. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks again. And I recognize that a lot of the questions were a bit open-ended and leave a room for a lot more discussion because of deep philosophical issues involved.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, good philosophical questions are always like that. I mean, there are questions that arise from misunderstanding or things that have a very simple answer, and just the questioner hasn't thought about them very carefully. But most of the questions that were asked today were not like that. I mean, they're good questions, and answers to them are always going to raise more questions, whatever you think the answers are. That's just the nature of philosophy, which is why I kind of love it.